This presentation is designed to provide a high-level overview of the control system and the creation of the Beatles as a social engineering tool. For those interested in a deeper dive into the Beatles conspiracy, the description box has links to my key presentations on the topic. To gain a more thorough understanding of the deep state structure, I strongly suggest that people conduct their own research. A question that I get asked a lot by people who are not familiar with the Beatles research is, why is the McCartney and Beatles conspiracy important? People will say, if it's true, what's the big deal? They just replaced the guy in the band. Or they might say, I never liked the Beatles anyway. Or, none of it matters because the music was great. These types of responses reflect the mindset that has been influenced by pop culture and is ubiquitous throughout today's society, regardless of the topic being discussed. Pop culture is the culture that was sold to the world, especially the West, through television sets and other mass media outlets. The aim was to diminish critical thinking skills by persuading individuals to allocate their time and intellectual capacity to meaningless pursuits. To achieve this, the appeal of pop culture needs to be pervasive, and in fact, it is. It can be found in television, Hollywood, social media, fast food, alcohol, drugs, porn, music, sports, and so on. In addition to reducing critical thinking, the control system used pop culture to eliminate traditional cultures that people were connected to through their family heritage. The values associated with traditional or ancestral culture help define a person's individuality. However, individualism is in direct conflict with the Marxist ideology of collectivism. Thus, culture that is based on traditions and ancestry is being replaced by an artificial homogenized construct that was created by social scientists. A population that does not have a connection to their ancestry will ultimately lead to groupthink, where consensus is given priority over critical evaluation. To understand the significance of the McCartney and Beatles conspiracy, we must first understand the system behind it. The control system uses official narratives to shape the minds of the population. Many of these narratives, particularly the significant ones, are based on events, movements, or lifestyles that were engineered and then promoted as natural occurrences through social engineering and propaganda. These narratives are repeated over and over until they become a fact in the minds of the controlled masses. To quote Joseph Goebbels, if you tell a big lie and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. This was also the approach used by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, a faction of Russian Marxists. The control system is made up of an intricate web of aristocratic bloodlines and a federation of secret societies, with Freemasonry being the most recognized. They are highly educated in the occult and claim to have the divine right to rule over the world. The fundamental ideology of the controllers for governing and managing populations worldwide is Marxism. The control system's objective is to attain a technocratic Marxist one-world system of governance, which is commonly known as the New World Order. The priesthood that drives the Marxist framework is heavily influenced by the ancient Egyptian and Babylonian mysteries, as well as Kabbalistic and Jewish mysticism. Aleister Crowley's ideology and religion of Thelema tap into the same sources, which is why Crowley's principles and teachings are very prominent in the system of control. Behind the scenes, Egyptian mythology and Crowley's ideology permeate the Beatles as an entity. Occult symbolism is visible on all of the Beatles album covers. Obvious examples would be the Beatles' second UK album, With the Beatles, which displays one-eye symbolism. The cover of their fifth UK album, Help, has the Beatles displaying Crowley's ritual signs, depicting the story of the Egyptian gods Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus. In spite of what we were told, the Beatles are not spelling out the word help in semaphore. Sgt. Pepper is in a league of its own and far too involved to get into with this presentation. If you're curious about the details of the album cover, I recommend reading memoirs for a detailed discussion. The spiritual mindset of the controllers, if we can call it that, is often described as Luciferian or satanic. In the memoirs of Billy Shears, Crowley is referred to as the father of modern Satanism. Two cults that closely align with Luciferian beliefs are the cult of Dionysus and the cult of Pan, of which Crowley was a member. The ancient Greek god Pan was associated with shepherds, hunters, wild mountains, forests, and meadows. He is often depicted as half man, half goat, with a beard and a snub nose, and is often shown playing his signature instrument, the panpipes. He is the god of vegetation and represents the manifestation of nature. Pan is the god of unrestrained bodily instincts and sexuality that runs rampant, and no social force can stop him. He is the lord of death, corruption, bodily decay, and dissolution. He is also the mindless mob instinct and the beast that takes control of man. Crowley's philosophy of pursuing one's true will embodies the mythology of Pan. The mythology of Pan is also the basis for the story of the Pied Piper, and the word pied means multicolored. On the Sgt. Pepper album cover, we see the four Beatles in multicolored or pied outfits. Each band member is holding a wind instrument, which is a nod to Pan and his flute. The Beatles are representing the cult of Pan, and by association, the ideology of Crowley's religion of Thelema. The Beatles are being presented as Pied Pipers. The Beatles and their music were instrumental in leading their followers into a new age, known as the Age of Aquarius, or what Crowley referred to as the Aeon of Horus. The counterculture of the 1960s was known as the Aquarian Conspiracy. The controllers devised a plan to establish a cult surrounding the Beatles that draws inspiration from and conforms to the cult of Pan. That cult is referred to as Paulism. Paulism is a religion that has fans idolizing and worshipping the Beatles and Paul McCartney. The Church of the Beatles, with its congregation of millions, has been led by their Pied Pipers into the New Age. Paulism is a play on Christian Paulism or Pauline theology, which was developed from the beliefs and doctrines espoused by Paul the Apostle through his writings. The Beatles version was not done as a tribute to the Christian faith, but to mock it. In March of 1966, John Lennon said that Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. He stated that he didn't need to argue about it because he is right and will be proved right, and added that the Beatles were now more popular than Jesus. In another interview, Lennon said that by 2012, the masses will be where we are today, and Paul should be Jesus by then.
They burned their records and spit on their images. But before they burned the records, they had to buy them.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did. I was just saying it as a fact. I was using expressions on things that I just read.
The Passover plot speculates that the Bible is a hoax and that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Jesus survived, and in order to create a new religion with himself as the Messiah, he made people believe that he'd risen from the dead.
He said to me once that the children of 2000 will be listening to the Beatles.
By 2012, the masses will be where we are today, and Paul should be Jesus by then.
2012 is an interesting date because it was the year of all the Mayan calendar hoopla. There are astrologers that believe that December 21st, 2012, the winter solstice, was actually the beginning of the Age of Aquarius. In the context of the occultism surrounding the Beatles, it meant that Jesus and the Christian Piscean Age had ended, and the New Age, the Aeon of Horus, which the Beatles helped to spearhead, had begun. I have explained in many presentations that Tavistock excels at creating cults and lowering the critical thinking capacity of adults to that of children. By people attaching themselves and following and worshipping bands, entertainers, celebrities, politicians, technology gurus, social media influencers, etc., they place themselves into categories that can be manipulated. The manipulation takes place through music, entertainment, mass media, and especially social media. All of these mechanisms release a constant barrage of pop culture stimuli that leaves many people in a dumbed down or childlike mental state that is incapable of critical thinking. An individual who has a cult mindset and cannot think for themselves is easily controlled. The brilliant part of the brainwashing, as evil as it is that people who are programmed don't know they are programmed. They are blind to the fact that their thoughts are not their own. And worse, they are unwittingly defending and enabling the paradigms and agendas that social scientists have placed in their heads. One programming tactic is the Marxist strategy and approach, which divides society into two categories, oppressors and victims. This approach was articulated by the Frankfurt School and was referred to as critical theory. The Frankfurt School was formed in 1923 by the Marxist George Lukács, who asked the question, who will save us from Western civilization? To transform a culture, Lukács and his cadre of communists and Bolsheviks believed that identifying oppressors and victims was necessary. It didn't matter if the oppressor was actually oppressing or if the victims were really victims. What mattered was the victim's perception of being victimized. To generate this perception, the controllers systematically bombarded the masses with propaganda which came from television, radio, movies, books, and other media. Gaslighting the target population is a technique that has worked extremely well and is still used today. In the practice of gaslighting, one person intentionally undermines another's perception of reality. As a result of this, the target person begins to question their own memories, judgments, and sanity. The ultimate goal, as described by Bertrand Russell, a member of the Fabian Society, was to produce an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Or as Max Horkheimer, a prominent member of the Frankfurt School, said, the revolution won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we work towards universal egalitarianism. It is important to note that universal egalitarianism is just another term for universal Marxism. Other prominent individuals from the Frankfurt School include Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and Erich Fromm. All of the above-mentioned individuals were Marxists, German, and members of the Jewish intellectual community. Germany was undoubtedly a center of Marxist philosophy as well as the home of the Rothschilds, who hail from Frankfurt. Is it possible that this is the reason why the Beatles were sent to Hamburg, which is often referred to as Germany's media capital? The victim-oppressor dialectic is also represented in Crowley's concept of the eons. In particular, the shift from the Eon of Osiris to the Eon of Horus. Crowley espoused that the Eon of Osiris, representing the Christian Piscean Age, was a period of oppression where humanity was bound by laws and rules, including religion, and that his Eon of Horus, or the Age of Aquarius, represents an age of liberation. The question arises as to whether the Eon of Horus is a time of enlightenment for everyone or just the elite class. Given that Crowley was a British spy and propagandist during World War I and part of the elite establishment, I highly doubt that he had a vision that extended beyond the inner circle of his cohorts. There are mythologists who equate the Age of Aquarius with Lucifer. The connection is traced back to the Luciferian characteristics of the Sumerian god Enki. Enki was known for his wisdom, magic, abilities to create, and mastery of the freshwater realms. Of course, water is linked to the Age of Aquarius. If Enki is a variation of Lucifer and the ruler of the freshwater realms, it implies that the Age of Aquarius is the Age of Lucifer. In other words, the water-bearer is the light-bearer. So what we have is an occult internationalist apparatus that is determined to restructure the world and rule it through a Marxist system of governance. As Max Horkheimer explained, it will be accomplished incrementally, year by year, and generation by generation. Let's now discuss the Tavistock Institute, which was established 3 years before the Frankfurt School. In 1920, after World War I, the Tavistock Clinic was created as an offshoot of Wellington House, which was the British military's propaganda department during the war. The clinic, originally founded in 1920 by Dr. Hugh Crichton Miller, was established with principles influenced by psychoanalysis, the field Sigmund Freud pioneered. Their stated objective was to study and aid World War I soldiers in overcoming shell shock. However, their real objective was to conduct psychological experiments to further develop and advance human mind control techniques. It was known as the Freudian Hilton due to Sigmund Freud's association with the clinic and Freud's daughter, Dr. Anna Freud, becoming a leading figure. It's worth mentioning that Sigmund Freud had a close connection with the Jewish fraternal order known as B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith is described as an international Jewish service group founded in New York City in 1843 by 12 German Jews, with Masonic traditions serving as the foundation of the organization. B'nai B'rith has been instrumental in the establishment of significant Jewish institutions, including the Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish activist organizations. What we can discern from Freud's associations, aside from being the poster child for Tavistock, is that he was also a Marxist and Freemason. It's also worth noting that Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, was instrumental in the establishment of the modern public relations industry, using his uncle's psychoanalytic theories to influence public opinion and consumer behavior. Edward Bernays had a close connection with the Tavistock Institute, both because of his family relationship with Sigmund Freud and his professional work in public relations and social engineering. He was instrumental in the popularization of Freudian psychoanalytic ideas in the United States and helped establish the intellectual foundation for the Institute's work on group psychology and mass manipulation. The clinic was taken over in 1932 by Dr. John Rawling Rees, a key figure in British Army intelligence. During the Second World War, Rees held the position of Brigadier General and was an expert in psychiatric warfare. Subsequently, Tavistock became the psychological warfare branch of the British military and intelligence services. In 1946, Tavistock was upgraded to become the central laboratory for developing hardcore brainwashing techniques and received a massive infusion of funds from the Rockefeller Foundation. In 1947, the clinic became the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. In 1948, Rees became president of the UN-linked World Federation of Mental Health, which became a major conduit for British operations in psychological warfare. Tavistock is the hub for mass mind manipulation and social engineering activities worldwide. It is a sophisticated organization used to shape the destiny of the world by changing the paradigms of modern society. Tavistock collaborates with other internationalist think tanks and has control mechanisms in academia, corporations, multimedia, intelligence, medicine, pharmaceuticals, and so on. Its range of disciplines includes anthropology, economics, organizational behavior, political science, psychoanalysis, psychology, and sociology. Think of Tavistock as the social engineering headquarters for the world. The control system, which Tavistock is part of, is organized in the same way as a corporation. It has a board of directors that includes noble and royal bloodlines, banking and industrialist families, secret societies, policy think tanks, and political and military groups, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, NATO, and major political parties. The board in particular is exempt from laws, taxes, and oversight that are imposed on the rest of humanity. This exemption is also explained in Dr. John Coleman's book on the Committee of 300. According to Coleman, the committee refers to itself as the Olympians. Tavistock social engineers and scientists, employing their Frankfurt ideology, produce and implement engineered events and movements, including the creation of music genres, to alter societal and cultural structures. A common thread across the Frankfurt School, Tavistock, and virtually all deep state social engineering and brainwashing efforts is the exploitation of psychology and the promotion of hedonism to create behavior modification. The porn industry is a clear example of promoting hedonism. Various studies suggest that the pornography industry worldwide is estimated to earn between $97 and $100 billion in annual revenue. The precursor to the Beatles and the counterculture of the 1960s was the Marxist Beat movement. The members of the Beat generation developed a reputation as new bohemian hedonists who celebrated nonconformity and spontaneous creativity, which was another nod to the cult of Pan. The movement traces its roots back to the 1940s with key figures like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, and Neil Cassidy. Although the movement's core ideas were forming in the late 1940s, it entered the public consciousness in the 1950s, gaining widespread attention with the publication of Allen Ginsberg's 1956 poem Howl, Jack Kerouac's 1957 novel On the Road, and William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch in 1959. British beat poet and writer Royston Ellis had an association in the early history of the Beatles. Legend has it that it was Ellis who suggested that the band change their name from Beatles with 2 E's to Beatles with an A to reflect their connection to the beat movement. From an occult perspective, the band's name is also a reference to the scarab beetle. The scarab beetle was a symbol of transformation, rebirth, and protection in ancient Egyptian belief systems, and it had great occult and spiritual significance. It's worth mentioning that John Lennon admired both Royston Ellis and Jack Kerouac. Beat writer William S. Burroughs was featured on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album. In the 1960s, the beat movement was integrated into the hippie and larger counterculture movements and had a significant impact on rock and roll and popular music. Their influence extended beyond the Beatles to include Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, the Grateful Dead, Jim Morrison, and many other bands and entertainers. The Beatles' music, especially their later albums, showed a shift towards more experimental and spiritually exploring themes corresponding with the beat philosophy of challenging conventions and seeking new experiences. The Marxist approach to implement their strategy of their one world order was done in stages. According to Dr. John Coleman's book on the Rothschilds, the First World War was fought to establish Bolshevism in Russia, as well as a home for the Jews in Palestine, as spelled out by the Balfour Declaration. During World War I, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a public statement that expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This declaration marked the first formal endorsement of Zionism by a major world power and became a foundational moment in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Second World War was fought to destroy Germany and Japan, establish the USSR as a communist world power, and extend Bolshevism's reach over 3/4 of the world. The Second World War also had a major impact on the makeup of the United States due to the influence of international communists in prominent positions. The United States transformed from a constitutional republic to an imperial force that aimed to dominate the world in the name of communism. Behind these changes stood the power, money, and plotting of the Rothschilds. It's important to note that after World War II, the United States was targeted to be systematically subverted in order to dismantle the country's core values and traditions. It's not a coincidence that the Beatles and the British invasion bands arrived in America less than 20 years after the end of the war. Conquering America was the ultimate prize for the Marxists, which would ensure their goal of world dominance. When the Beatles arrived in the States in February of 1964, one of their taglines was, "The Beatles Conquer America." This short history lesson on the hidden operations behind the scenes demonstrates that there is a control system with a very specific purpose. The objective of that agenda is to implement Marxist ideology worldwide and to manage the governance system through technology. The primary approach to implement Marxist ideology was through a strategy referred to as cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism is a term that has often been associated with the Frankfurt School. In contemporary discourse, it is used to talk about how Marxist theory is applied to cultural and societal structures instead of traditional economic class struggles. The focus is on the power structures that exist in cultural institutions such as media, education, and religion. As Max Horkheimer explained, cultural Marxism is about subversion from within. Social engineering is all about altering behavior. Music and entertainment are essential tools for social scientists. Both the music industry and entertainment, with Hollywood being a notable example, can have a tremendous impact on morals, beliefs, and lifestyles, and the social scientists at Tavistock and their network of enablers are well versed in this. During the presentation thus far, I have referred to Marxism, communism, and Bolshevism almost interchangeably, and that's because there is significant overlap between the three. Developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Marxism is a socio-economic and political theory analyzing class structure and advocating for a classless, stateless society. Communism is a political and economic system derived from Marxist theory. In its ideal form, as described by Marx, communism is a society without states and classes, with shared ownership of the means of production. Bolshevism was an application of Marxism and the revolutionary socialist movement led by Vladimir Lenin. After the 1917 October Revolution, Bolshevism became the foundation of the Soviet Union, later known as Marxist-Leninist ideology. At their core, Marxism, communism, and Bolshevism are all Jewish ideologies and movements. John Lennon made a notable comment regarding Jewish involvement in the music business, stating that, quote, show business is an extension of Jewish religion. His remark, often cited in discussions about the history of the Beatles, reflects Lennon's observation of the significant role Jews played in the post-war British and American entertainment industries. The comment was reported to be made in the context of numerous Jewish figures who were instrumental in shaping the Beatles' career, which included their manager Brian Epstein and other key personnel. Although the quote has been interpreted in many ways, Lennon himself often chose not to elaborate on its meaning. In order to clarify what Lennon was referring to, let's examine some of the Jewish cast around the Beatles. The following information is sourced from a 2014 article by the Jewish online publication Orthodox Union. It is well known that Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, was Jewish. Epstein's music management company, NEMS, was almost entirely comprised of Jewish businessmen. David Jacobs, who was Epstein's top lawyer, was responsible for negotiating the deals that saw the Beatles' image on merchandise. Pivotal in the launch of the Beatles' popularity were two Jewish New York radio personalities, Murray Kaufman, known as Murray the K, and Bruce Morrow, known as Cousin Brucey. Both were prominent during the band's arrival in New York in 1964. Cousin Brucey, who was born Bruce Meyerowitz, is perhaps New York's most legendary radio personality. During Beatlemania, Bruce was the top DJ on WABC radio, which he nicknamed WA Beatles C. Prior to 1965, no musical performer had attempted to play a concert at an outdoor sports stadium. Sid Bernstein, a Jewish New York impresario, leveraged the Beatles' enormous popularity to arrange their iconic concert at Shea Stadium. Many of the Beatles' most famous publicity photographs were taken by Jewish photographer Dezo Hoffman. Richard Lester, who was also Jewish, was the director charged with the task of bringing the Beatles' first motion picture, A Hard Day's Night, to the big screen. Lester, who was raised by traditional Jewish parents in Philadelphia, would later direct the band's second movie, Help. The producers of these iconic films were Walter Shenson and Bud Orenstein, who were both Jewish. Linda McCartney, the wife of Billy, was also Jewish. Her maiden name was not Eastman. Her father was born Leopold Vail Epstein and later changed his name to Lee Eastman. Her mother, Louise Lindner Eastman, was the daughter of Max Lindner, a major Jewish philanthropist in Cleveland, Ohio. Linda McCartney's three children with Billy, Mary, Stella, and James, are considered Jewish, as is her daughter Heather from her first marriage. Alan Klein, who managed the Beatles from May 1969 until 1973, was Jewish. In October 2011, Billy, a.k.a. Paul McCartney, married his third wife, Nancy Shevell, who was Jewish and a second cousin of Barbara Walters, who was also Jewish. Ringo Starr's stepfather, Harry Graves, was Jewish. It's been rumored that his mother, Elsie Gleave-Starkey, has Jewish ancestry. Ringo's wife, Barbara Bach, who was originally Barbara Goldbach, is Jewish. In a 2008 LA Times article, Joel Stein, an American journalist, author, and cultural pundit who is Jewish, penned an article that dispels any thoughts that Hollywood is not run by Jews. In the article he states, "As a proud Jew, I want America to know about our accomplishments," and adds, "Yes, we control Hollywood. Without us, you would be flipping between the 700 Club and Davy and Goliath." I realize that for some people this segment of the presentation may be very uncomfortable, but facts are facts. In order to fully comprehend the machine behind the Beatles' rise to fame, this is a necessary aspect of their story that needs to be discussed because it connects to the control system, particularly when it comes to the music and entertainment industries. It is undeniable that the counterculture of the 1960s was an influential time that led to significant changes in the collective psyche. The change was a departure from the traditional values and religions that were prevalent at the time, specifically Christianity. The shift was to transform the mindset of the younger generation towards Crowley's philosophy of, if it feels good, do it. The result was the adoption of new morals and behavior standards that included free love, which encouraged promiscuity, drugs, and the opposition to everything their parents held dear. The Frankfurt School, Tavistock, and the occult underbelly that permeates the control system believe that dismantling the old structures is necessary in order for the phoenix to rise from the ashes. The Beatles played a central role in the culture war waged by the Marxists during the 1960s. One would be hard-pressed to watch any documentary about the Beatles or the 1960s without hearing the phrase, the Beatles were a cultural phenomenon. Thus, the Beatles were designed as a social engineering instrument to restructure and modify the social and cultural landscape of the world. The Beatles laid the groundwork for all pop music genres that follow them. The social scientists replicated the Beatles' template in other genres, each of which was tailored to a distinct or new demographic that needed to be socially engineered. Taylor Swift, with her cult following of Swifties, is a current-day example of the template being employed. She is often compared to the Beatles for her alleged songwriting prowess, as well as her ability to shape and define culture. The plot to subvert America and the rest of the world was rolled out by the London-based Tavistock. This is the reason why the Beatles, and bands like the Rolling Stones, The Who, and the Kinks were referred to as the British Invasion. And it's not by accident that the fervor over the Beatles was referred to as Beatlemania. Mania is a psychiatric term, and Tavistock is all about psychiatric manipulation. The characteristics of mania include abnormally elevated moods and increased energy that significantly impair functioning, rapid speech, racing thoughts, distractibility, psychomotor agitation, grandiosity, and impulsivity are some of the key symptoms of a manic state. During the peak of Beatlemania, many first-hand accounts suggest that girls experienced extreme physical reactions during Beatles concerts, including urinating themselves because of overwhelming excitement. Irish singer Bob Geldof, who attended a Beatles concert in the mid-1960s, recalled seeing, quote, rivers of urine running down the aisles. He stated that the stories of teenage girls wetting themselves over John Lennon and Paul McCartney are true. Now let's circle back to the question as to why the McCartney and Beatles conspiracy is important to understand. We'll start with the replacement of Paul McCartney. The replacement of Paul McCartney in late 1966 is important because when he was replaced by Billy Shears, very few people noticed. Yes, there was a segment of the fan base that looked at the Sgt. Pepper album cover and noticed something was off about McCartney. They noted that he looked different, but then again, so did all the other Beatles. Gone were the mop tops and suits. The new look featured the Beatles with longer hair and mustaches dressed in colorful band outfits. What the Controllers did was to change the entire look of the band so that Billy, now playing the role of McCartney, would not stand out. This included placing Billy within the intricate and colorful cover art of the album, which further diverted attention from him as the fan looked at the panacea of psychedelic visuals. Anyone questioning if the guy on the album cover was really Paul McCartney would eventually resolve their intrigue by thinking, who else could it be other than Paul McCartney? It has to be him. No one was thinking in terms of a conspiracy about Paul being replaced. As time passed, the doubters faded away, the questions subsided, and Billy successfully became Paul. This was a significant accomplishment by Tavistock and the band's handlers. They were able to replace one of the most well-known musicians and entertainers in the world with an imposter, and virtually no one noticed. The significance of this achievement from the perspective of the social engineers cannot be overstated. This was a crucial outcome. By successfully swapping out McCartney, they could conceivably replace anyone. From a Tavistock and Deep State perspective, the replacement of Paul McCartney proved to be a resounding success. Another question that many people ask is how and when Paul died. Was it an accident, or was it all pre-planned? Was his death in August of 1966, or was it in September or November? Due to the lack of direct evidence of Paul's death, for example, eyewitness accounts or public records such as a death certificate, it is uncertain how he died. If Paul's death was part of a deep state operation, It's not a difficult task for the operatives to cover up his death and alter government records. Couple that with people around Paul who were hushed up, paid off, or threatened, and the number of voices asking questions decreases significantly. Those who decided to ask questions were branded as crazy and ridiculed. And remember, this was back when the internet and social media did not exist, so the ability to communicate en masse was not available. In Billy's situation, his bloodline and allegiance to secret societies kept everything within the inner circle, which included key players and acts within the music and entertainment industry. As time went by, the risk of exposure decreased dramatically, to the point where the vast majority of people believe Billy is Paul McCartney. If Paul's death was planned, it's possible that it was a ritual sacrifice, and Memoirs implies that this is indeed the case. The book also claims that John and Paul entered into a Faustian bargain in October of 1963. This sacrifice, which the book refers to as, quote, death for success, was done to ensure the band achieved unparalleled fame and influence. The book explains that Paul was the sacrificial lamb or Christ figure who would bring about the new age. This ties back to the cult of Paulism, which I discussed earlier. The parallels to Jesus are not coincidental. Another school of thought among those who examine the McCartney or Paul is dead conspiracy believes that Paul did not die but remained alive after 1966. The premise is that he stepped out for whatever reason, and when he did, Billy took on the role. Regardless of which scenario someone believes, the fact is, Paul was replaced. The evidence is overwhelming that the man who has been playing McCartney for 6 decades is not biological Paul. Some will argue that the evidence is circumstantial, and that is true. But people are convicted of crimes every day in court on the basis of circumstantial evidence. In fact, Billy has been dropping clues since the very beginning and continues to do so, letting us know that he is not Paul. My personal take is that Paul did die on September 11th, 1966, and it was likely a ritual sacrifice. Knowing how deeply involved the controllers are in the occult is a major reason why I came to this conclusion. September 11th is a very important date in occult circles, and blood sacrifice, whether animal or human, plays a major role in their rituals. War is an example of blood sacrifice that very few people consider in that context. I know others will disagree and claim he died in late August or November, but my position has always been dead is dead. And for what it's worth, Memoirs states the date was September 11th, 1966. Now that being said, Paul McCartney being replaced, whether because of his death or stepping out of the role, is a subplot to the bigger conspiracy involving the Beatles. The bigger picture has to do with the Beatles being used as a massive psychological operation to socially engineer at a worldwide level. My contention has been that even if Paul were always Paul and Billy never existed, the Beatles would still be a significant and strategic tool for the social engineers. In order to comprehend the deeper conspiracy that surrounds the Beatles, it's important to first examine their early history to see how the stage was set. After completing this section of the presentation, I will conclude by describing why the overall conspiracy is more significant than simply focusing on Paul being replaced. As I have explained in many of my presentations and interviews, the official narrative of the Beatles, which is the classic tale of going from rags to riches, tells a very different story when scrutinized. It's the type of story that everyone loves. 4 working-class young men from Liverpool met Brian Epstein in November of 1961. Epstein, who was running his family's North End music stores in Liverpool, became the band's manager and went on to secure a record contract with EMI Parlophone under the tutelage of George Martin in June of 1962. From that moment on, the Beatles went on to achieve unparalleled fame and became one of the most dominant forces in the history of pop music. Lennon and McCartney were regarded as genius songwriters, the band was characterized as brilliant musicians, and the Beatles were considered by many to be the greatest rock band to have ever existed. The story is well known by Beatle fans in particular. However, once the layers are peeled back, a very different story emerges. The truth is that leading up to their first Hamburg performances in August of 1960, The Beatles were mediocre at best from a musicianship standpoint, and they displayed no songwriting prowess. They were a below-average bar and club band that played cover songs. Their first manager, Alan Williams, recounted in the 1980s documentary The Complete Beatles that he was told not to bring that bum group the Beatles to Hamburg. In an old interview with their first drummer, Pete Best, Pete explained that while in Hamburg, they would play 7 or so hours a night, then depart the club and wake up at 3 p.m. the next day. They needed to be back at the venue by 6 p.m. Thus, the band had a 3-hour time limit to get up, eat, and dress before returning to the club. Their schedule, as well as the temptations of residing in Hamburg's red light district, implies that songwriting was not part of their activities. In Joseph Niesgoda's book, Lenin Prophecy, he explains that the period between their arrival in Hamburg in August of 1960 and their heading back to Liverpool in December of that year, nothing significant transpired for the band. In fact, Lennon and McCartney returned home disappointed. Then, beginning in January of 1961, a band with limited experience and less than a stellar reputation began to schedule gigs regularly. Their gigging was so consistent that it accounted for almost 2/3 of the year. Anyone who would like to confirm this schedule can look up their live performance schedule on Wikipedia. A logical question to ask is, how is it that a band that is not very good and has no track record is consistently booked by bars and clubs? This is the first indication of a possible problem with the narrative. Then in November of 1961, they met Brian Epstein. On January 1st, 1962, 2 months after meeting Epstein, the Beatles were at Decca Records cutting a 15-song demo. The demo consisted of 12 cover songs and 3 original compositions, Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, and Love of the Loved. None of these songs make it onto any of the Beatles' albums or singles while the band is active. After recording the demo, Decca declined to sign the band. In February of 1962, Brian Epstein played demo tapes for George Martin. After listening to the tapes, Martin tells Brian, "If you want me to judge them based on what you are playing me, I'm sorry. I need to turn you down." In other documented interviews, George Martin went on to say that they didn't impress him, that he thought their music was rubbish, they had nothing behind them, and it was not obvious they were songwriters at the time. At this juncture, Decca and EMI Parlophone refused to sign the Beatles. In March of 1962, even after being rejected by 2 major labels, the Beatles somehow landed a gig with the BBC. A bar and club band that has no track record, plays cover songs, and was rejected by 2 major record labels somehow secured an opportunity to perform at the BBC. The Live at the BBC performances lasted from March of 1962 to May of 1965. It's worth mentioning that the BBC show was not actually live. The songs were pre-recorded with the ability to record multiple takes. If you're recording with takes, then that's not a live performance. At this point, given the Beatles' lack of accomplishments, it certainly appears that there is a significant effort being made behind the scenes to propel the band forward. In June of 1962, George Martin reversed his decision and signed the Beatles to a record contract. The reason for the reversal is unclear, but I suspect it was initiated by either his immediate boss, Len Wood, or the head of EMI, Sir Joseph Lockwood. It's possible that Martin was not previously aware of the Deep State's plans for the band. It's worth noting that George Martin did not work directly with the Beatles after signing them. The job was given to Ron Richards, who later produced the Hollies. According to memoirs, Martin was told to work directly with the band after the Beatles failed to achieve the desired results during rehearsal and recording with Richards. In other words, Martin was informed that delegating the assignment was not an option. In the August-September issue of the music publication Mercy Beat, Ringo was announced as the new drummer for the band, replacing Pete Best. According to the article, the Beatles will travel to London to record with EMI and record songs written for them, which they received from George Martin. Note that the article did not state that the band would record songs written by them. It was clearly stated that they will record songs written for them. The article supports Martin's statements in interviews that Love Me Do was the best song they had to offer at the time, and that's if they actually wrote Love Me Do. George Martin mentioned in other interviews that he was very mindful that Love Me Do was not the big hit he was hoping for and that he had to find songs for the band to perform. It's important to note that in the 1980s documentary The Complete Beatles, Lennon and McCartney were reported to have written over 100 songs between 1956 and 1962, either separately or together. It ends up, perhaps conveniently, that none of the songs were recorded. The question is, where were the 100 songs that John and Paul had supposedly written when they started working with George Martin? It is reasonable to conclude that the songs were either not very good or the story is a complete fabrication. From my perspective, it is the latter. Norman Smith, who was responsible for the Beatles' engineering on their first 6 studio albums, revealed in a 1971 New Music Express interview that he was not impressed with the band when he began working with them. He stated that they were terrible and failed in the studio. He then went on to say that the Beatles talked their way into a recording deal with EMI. In the real world, a band cannot talk its way into a contract. They are either capable of playing and performing, or they are not. If they cannot, then they are shown the door. According to the official narrative, George Martin tried to find songs for them to record, but the Beatles resisted, preferring to record their own compositions, even though there is no evidence they had any songs to record or that they were even songwriters. The notion that these 4 inexperienced band members were going to challenge George Martin, who was not only their producer, but also the head of the Parlophone label, is ridiculous. The Beatles were not in a position to debate with Martin about how he was going to manage and handle them. The reason for taking everyone through the early history of the band, leading up to their EMI contract and George Martin, is to show that the Beatles were not skilled musicians or songwriters. As George Martin explained in interviews, when he met them, they had nothing behind them. Yet, they reached a peak of fame like no other band before or after them. How did that happen? Was the process organic, or were the Beatles manufactured? If it were organic, there would need to be obvious evidence and proof that they had extraordinary musical and songwriting skills, but the cracks in the narrative point in the opposite direction. In 2 interviews from 1966, one on August 5th with the BBC, after the Beatles released their 7th studio album, Revolver, Paul McCartney stated, "We're limited as a group. We're the first to say we're not all that good musically." 2 months prior, in June of 1966, he made a similar comment at a press conference at the Hilton in Japan. Yet, despite their obvious and admitted musical shortcomings, their trajectory from 1962 to 1966 was absolutely spectacular. In the August 5th, 1966 BBC interview, McCartney also said that the only time they need to force themselves to write songs is when an album or film comes up. Forcing themselves to write was an interesting choice of words. He also stated that we, referring to himself and John, don't usually write between albums, maybe 1 or 2 songs. Then we write a great big batch. Because Paul qualified his statement by saying maybe 1 or 2, the word maybe can also imply that no songwriting took place between their album releases. Whether the number of songs allegedly written between albums is 1, 2, or even 0, Paul's statement is completely in contradiction with the official narrative, which states that the Beatles were a constant songwriting machine. We're told they wrote in the studio, while they were touring, on film sets, and during their holidays and vacations. However, during the BBC interview, Paul revealed that the official narrative regarding when they supposedly wrote their music is not true. How can they be writing all the time if, according to McCartney, they wrote in great big batches? Even the BBC interviewer had a hard time believing that they could write 12 or more songs in such a short amount of time. The interviewer's perplexity was reinforced when John and Paul explained that with their last album, Revolver, it took weeks to write just 1 song. So which is it? Is it a multi-week process to write 1 song, or a multi-week process to write a dozen songs? Also, during the interview, Paul discusses the song Yesterday and said, "We didn't have to show ourselves up again in the studio." According to my British listeners, the phrase "we didn't have to show ourselves up" is an expression used by someone who wants to avoid embarrassment. In the US, the comment would be interpreted as not being present or not attending the recording session. Either way, Paul is stating that, except for his vocal, he was not on the recording of yesterday, even though he is credited with playing the acoustic guitar on the track. The big batch writing approach is the story behind the Rubber Soul album, which, when I analyzed it, was filled with gaps and is extremely problematic for the official narrative. There are two fundamental problems with the making of Rubber Soul. The first problem with the story is the feasibility of writing, learning, rehearsing, arranging, and recording 13 to 16 new songs in 30 days, which is highly unlikely. I would suggest that it is actually impossible. The second issue is the cycle time to manufacture the record, which includes creating record labels, album art, sleeve design, printing, packaging, and distribution. A process that back in the day required 6 to 8 weeks or longer once the final acetate or lacquer was created, but took only 2.5 weeks for Rubber Soul. This shortened cycle time meant that the process of manufacturing record labels and record sleeves was already underway before the Beatles entered the studio. This was made possible because the songs for Rubber Soul were pre-written by outside songwriters and the instrumental tracks were pre-recorded by studio musicians. With the songs written and pre-recorded, the song titles and run times were already known well in advance of the Beatles' arrival at EMI on October 11th of 1965. Knowing the song titles and run times allowed George Martin to finalize the song sequencing. With the song titles, run times, and sequencing completed, the printing process could commence with enough lead time to ensure that Rubber Soul is available in retail stores by December 3rd. The missing link in the process was the recording of the vocals, and that is what the Beatles were in the studio to do. After the vocals were finished, George Martin mixed the vocal tracks with the pre-recorded instrumental tracks to complete the songs. Now let's dig deeper into some of the problematic aspects of the official narrative to understand why the process had to begin well in advance of the Beatles arriving at the studio. Recording for the Rubber Soul sessions began on October 12, 1965, and ended late in the evening on November 11th. To be more precise, we were told that the November 11th session ran for 13 hours, starting at 6 p.m. and ending at 7 a.m. on the morning of November 12th. According to the narrative, 4 songs still needed to be finished on November 11th, which is the final day of recording. The story becomes more implausible because 2 songs, Girl and You Won't See Me, have yet to be written. The task of writing 2 songs from scratch, learning them, rehearsing them, and recording them in 13 hours is not even close to reality. And keep in mind that Paul stated that they, meaning the band, were not very good musically, which further complicates the story. If this was not challenging enough, 2 other songs need to be completed. Those 2 songs were I'm Looking Through You and Wait. Even though Wait was pulled in from the help sessions, it still required overdubbing. To summarize, the account we are given about what happened on November 11th, the final day of recording, is highly questionable. According to the narrative, recording concludes, additional mixing takes place, and George Martin completes the song sequencing on November 16th, one day before the lacquer is finalized on November 17th. Once the sequencing is finished and the lacquer is finalized, the printing process for the center labels and album sleeves can begin. This process requires a lead time of 6 to 8 weeks, with 6 weeks representing an expedited process. 6 weeks out from when the lacquer was finalized on November 17th means that the labels and sleeves will not be ready until late December after Christmas. If the process is 8 weeks, the labels and sleeves won't be available until mid-January. Remember, EMI needs the album in retail by December 3rd for the Christmas buying season, so late December or mid-January was not an option. It's important to understand that the center labels on vinyl records are affixed to the vinyl during pressing, not afterward. Once the vinyl is pressed, the album is inserted into the record sleeves. This means if the pressing of Rubber Soul began on November 17th, or at the latest, November 18th, the final center labels with the sequence song titles, as well as the record sleeves, must be at the plant when pressing begins. This is because the process of pressing the records cannot proceed without the final center labels or sleeves, especially the labels, which are adhered to the record at the same time as the vinyl is pressed. With an 8-week cycle time, the process to design, approve, proof, print, and deliver the labels and sleeves would have had to begin on or around October 8th, 4 days before the Beatles started recording. An expedited process of 6 weeks means that the process had to begin on or around October 22nd. By October 21st, the Beatles had the basic rhythm tracks recorded for 3 songs, Run for Your Life, Drive My Car, and Day Tripper, with 2 other songs being worked on. That means 11 songs were still in the ether. I also calculated a 4-week cycle time, which shows that the process needs to begin no later than November 5th, at which time the Beatles still had 6 of the 16 songs to nail down. In any of the cases, it's clear that the song titles and run times were known beforehand, which allowed the sequencing process to be completed and the manufacturing process for the labels and sleeves to begin. According to the official story, within 24 hours of song sequencing, EMI was able to print thousands of finalized center labels and record sleeves that contained the titles of the songs in sequenced order. This remarkable feat enabled Rubber Soul to arrive in retail stores by December 3rd of 1965. A process that was supposed to take 6 to 8 weeks was magically reduced to 17 days from the time we were told the sequencing was completed on November 16th. So the question is, how was EMI able to get Rubber Soul into stores by December 3rd? The answer is, all the heavy lifting was done before the Beatles stepped foot in the studio. Since the songs for Rubber Soul were pre-written and recorded in advance, George Martin had everything he needed with ample lead time to get the printing process underway. The only thing missing were the vocal tracks, and that is what the Beatles did during the 30 days. They sang. George Martin then mixed the final vocal tracks with the instrumentals to complete the songs. With the labels and sleeves already at the plant, pressing could begin. It was this process that enabled the initial batch of records to be in retail outlets by December 3rd. I believe that this was the technique employed to record the Beatles' first 7 UK studio albums between 1962 and 1966, covering Please Please Me to Revolver. Starting with Sgt. Pepper, and in particular on the White Album, I believe that the Beatles, especially John and George, wrote more of their own material and played on more of the recorded tracks. However, I highly suspect that outside songwriters and studio musicians were still being utilized during the period of 1967 through 1970. You'll notice that I excluded Billy from the, quote, writing and playing more scenario because I believe that he was always writing and playing on Beatle tracks, perhaps even before 1967. For example, his claim to have written the music to In My Life in 1965 is a possible clue that he was involved in the Beatles' music prior to 1967. In terms of operations management, I think it's highly probable that Theodor Adorno from the Frankfurt School was a significant stakeholder working alongside George Martin, who was the managing director. I also think it's likely that both Adorno and Martin contributed to the songwriting, along with a half-dozen talented songwriters from the Tavistock EMI staff, especially during the 1962 through 1966 period. I also think it's possible that Phil Spector, working with Martin, participated in the recording and production of the music beyond his work on the Beatles' Let It Be album. My suspicion is based on a hard-to-find interview Spector did with Roy Carr in 1976 for Ram magazine. In that interview, Spector claimed that his involvement with the Beatles was not limited to the Let It Be album, but went back to the very beginning. Spector's association with the LA-based Wrecking Crew, who were the go-to studio musicians hired to record pop music in the 1960s and 70s, makes his claim intriguing at the very least. Another question that comes up often is who do I think were some of the studio musicians playing on Beatles recordings? Apart from Andy White, Eric Clapton, Billy Preston, and Nicky Hopkins, who are acknowledged for playing on Beatle tracks, other possible studio players on Beatle recordings include Bernard Purdie, Ronnie Verrill, Hal Blaine, Ginger Baker, Donovan, Jimmy Page, Vic Flick, Big Jim Sullivan, Herbie Flowers, Jack Bruce, Jim Keltner, Glenn Campbell, and Alan White. I have no doubt there are other names I haven't identified, but these are the musicians I think played on Beatles songs. I should also add that it is very possible that Andy White, Billy Preston, Eric Clapton, and Nicky Hopkins played on more tracks than what the mainstream sources acknowledge. For example, I think it's highly probable that George Martin hired Andy White to drum on most, if not all, of the Please Please Me album. In my opinion, Rubber Soul is the silver bullet proving that the Beatles did not write all their own music or play on all their recorded tracks. If you're interested in learning more about my research on the Beatles' music, please refer to the links in the description box below. We can see that even the Beatles themselves, as illustrated in the August 5, 1966 BBC interview, were telling a different story than that of the official narrative. The question becomes, who do we believe? Do we trust the storytellers from the media or the two men who are supposedly the band's legendary songwriters? The funny thing is that both stories are not credible. The Beatles, in particular Lennon and McCartney, were not writing songs every waking moment of their lives, and they weren't writing a dozen or more songs on demand. The songs, especially during the early period of 1962 through 1966, were written behind the scenes by ghostwriters while the Beatles were traveling around the world playing their roles. I believe Paul's comment about writing in, quote, great big batches was actually in reference to the band having to learn the vocals for the songs that were selected for a particular album. The Beatles were not a group of superhuman musical geniuses. The band consisted of 4 young men who were groomed and schooled to play their defined roles in a deep state operation that targeted the masses, specifically the younger generation, to be socially engineered. The question of how much knowledge the Beatles had about what they were involved in is a good one. I seriously doubt that they were aware of the deeper end-to-end aspects of the operation. Only a small number of people had that level of knowledge. Everyone else involved, including the Beatles, were in a compartmentalized capacity and played their part accordingly. That being said, suffice to say that the Beatles knew they were not writing all their songs or playing on all of their recorded tracks, especially between 1962 and 1966. From that point of view, they had to know that they were active participants in a massive deception. My research has shown that the official narrative around the Beatles, which describes the band as consisting of 4 magical musicians who brought us the brilliant songwriting duo of Lennon and McCartney, is a myth. In fact, in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine in December of 1970, John Lennon referred to the Beatles, Paul McCartney, and Bob Dylan as myths. Tavistock and other control mechanisms, such as the mass media and the music and entertainment industry, were responsible for manufacturing their rise to stardom. Without the deep state machine behind them, the Beatles would have faded away before they even started. What Tavistock did was to recruit 4 young men who were likely on their radar from early on to undergo grooming and training for their assigned roles. How early in life they were identified is, of course, speculative. I suspect they were already in a deep state program by the time they arrived in Hamburg in August of 1960. John Lennon was 17 when his mother Julia passed away. According to mainstream sources, his mother's death had a profound effect on him, resulting in a period of heavy drinking, frequent fights, and rage. His father, Freddie, was absent from his life, so he was raised by his Aunt Mimi. Paul McCartney's mother, Mary, passed away when he was 14. Information regarding his father, Jim McCartney, is scarce. Apart from being a musician, Jim also worked as a salesman for a cotton merchant, and in another job, he operated a lathe machine. On Paul McCartney's Wikipedia page, there is no link for Jim McCartney to help us learn more about him. I find the lack of information regarding McCartney's parents strange, given his level of fame. What is also odd is that Paul McCartney did not attend Jim's funeral in 1976. What compelling reason would there be for not attending a parent's funeral? The story goes that McCartney, who was about to tour, was advised by his stepmother not to attend the funeral to avoid the chaos of his presence. It seems to me that he could have rescheduled the start of the tour and discreetly paid his respects without causing any disturbance. Perhaps Paul McCartney failed to attend his father's funeral because he's not Paul and Jim was not his father. The Beatles' constant gigging between January 1961 and their arrival in the United States on February 7, 1964, served as a form of boot camp. The band underwent a rigorous training process to prepare them for taking Beatlemania worldwide. This involved teaching the band how to play the songs they were to perform on the world stage. Some of those performances were live, others had the band miming to a backing track, and other times the performances were enhanced post-production. This was the case with their performance at Shea Stadium. According to Brian Epstein in the October 1965 edition of Beatles' book, their vocals needed to be re-recorded in the studio before releasing the concert footage. The overdubbing was necessary due to the noise bleed from the screaming audience and the vocals being sung through the stadium's PA system, resulting in poor playback quality. If the noise level of the crowd was affecting the vocals, then any other instrument on stage, such as guitars, bass, and drums, were also affected. The vast majority of fans don't know how post-production editing is utilized to package a band's image. The illusion must have both visual and audio appeal because the band or artist is being sold as a product, and the Beatles were no exception. An example of fixing live performances after the fact can be illustrated with Thin Lizzy's 1977 live album, Live and Dangerous. According to their producer Tony Visconti, 75% of the album was recorded in the studio, with only the drums and audience noise remaining from the original live recordings. Visconti said that overdubbing and production were essential in order for the listener to hear a professional-sounding band. Several big-name rock bands have been accused of using backing tracks during live performances, with some accusations stemming from video evidence or public statements. Bands such as Kiss, Motley Crue, Shinedown, Wasp, Aerosmith, and Santa Cruz have been specifically named in these allegations. Other acts like Fozzy and Black Sabbath have also been linked to the practice. The Beatles were created as a result of a deep state strategy to influence the masses to adopt a different set of values and beliefs. The creation of the Beatles as a massive psychological operation illustrates the extent to which the control system will go to socially engineer the population to achieve its end state objectives. As previously mentioned, the Beatles were a cultural phenomenon by any measure. Their impact on society's beliefs, values, and behavior is highly significant. Their influence is still present in the minds of millions of fans today. The Beatles were marketed as something new and significant, particularly among young people who subscribe to the counterculture mindset of free love, drugs, and opposition to anything considered oppressive, whether real or imagined. The Beatles were the Pied Pipers of the cult of Pan. They laid the foundation for other bands and artists to follow and build upon. A cult is typically characterized as a group with excessive devotion to a person, idea, object, or belief system, often with a charismatic leader at its center. Many Beatle fans, particularly those who are devoted followers, exhibit cult-like behavior. The bond between the band is so strong that even though the group broke up 55 years ago, millions of fans across the world continue to idolize and worship them in a godlike manner. The argument I hear over and over is that the music is great, so how can that be a bad thing? I agree that the music is great, but it is music with an agenda. One of the unfortunate downsides of the Beatles' narrative is the psychological programming has conditioned the minds of superior musicians and songwriters to believe that their talent and skills will always be inferior to the brilliance of the Fab Four. This is a clear indication of the programming's effectiveness, particularly in its impact on the minds of many musicians and songwriters. Social scientists have perfected the art of knowing which buttons to press to direct individuals toward the ultimate goal of the control system, and they do it in a very subtle, methodical, and incremental way. To believe that the Beatles achieved their accomplishments organically or by escaping the control system is naive. Nothing as significant as the Beatles comes about naturally. The direction of society and culture is fundamentally altered by the manufacturing and implementation of significant events and movements. The deep state created the Beatles to carry out an agenda that was based on Marxist ideology. The Beatles were not just a band, they were and still are a Marxist zeitgeist. Now to answer the question why the Beatles conspiracy is important. The conspiracy is significant because it includes all the elements of how the control system manipulates the masses. To start with, it illustrates how the power of music, a form of media that conveys emotions, ideas, and values, can be used as a powerful tool to indoctrinate a population with new morals, beliefs, and lifestyles. It reveals the power of creating cults of personality in the form of Pied Pipers to guide the masses. It provides insight into the psychological techniques used in mass manipulation, as well as the ideologies and tactics of the controllers, which are based in Marxism. It helps us identify the people and groups who form the deep state, such as the Frankfurt School in Tavistock, as well as the connections to aristocratic bloodlines and secret societies. It demonstrates how the principles of the occult and the theologies of the cult of Pan, the Lema, the Kabbalah, Luciferianism, and Satanism are woven into world events and movements. The Beatles conspiracy serves as a model for decoding other conspiracies since it encompasses many of the tools used to social engineer and brainwash. Understanding the players, motives, and mechanisms used by the deep state to manipulate our minds can help us decode and recognize other efforts by the control system to deceive and reshape humanity. Knowing who your enemy is and how they operate is essential for defeating them. Since 2016, when I began researching the Beatles' unofficial narrative, followers of my research have stated that this conspiracy was their red pill. The conspiracy broke down the wall of illusion and pulled back the curtain to expose the great odds working behind the scenes. It opened a door that made people aware that there are no sacred cows, and we should question everything that has been fed to us by this artificial construct known as pop culture. George Harrison said it well when he told us, "If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there." Thanks for listening.